Hello, welcome back to our fourth lecture in the series on Western Civilization 101. Today, with our fourth lecture, Dr. Robinson will finish discussing the Sumerians. Of course, Sumerians who lived in the ancient Near East in a place called Mesopotamia. I've mentioned before, and you probably heard this, but the Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, obviously present-day Iraq. He will finish discussing these people, talking about their art. Archaeologists have uncovered Sumerian figurines and different artwork, not just the figurines, of course, that come from this period. So it's very fascinating. He'll also discuss a little bit about Sumerian education because, as you know, we by now are in the historic period, so we have the invention of writing, of course, by the Sumerians, and it is called cuneiform, it's the beginning of writing. Not writing as we know it today, as you probably realized and you've already learned, but it is a start for what we will eventually have as our alphabet. Science. Dr. Robinson will discuss Sumerians as far as their scientific achievements, which they do have. Technology as well. Social classes. Yes, there was a structure among the Sumerian people. Not everyone was at the top of the social ladder. Of course, not everyone was at the bottom. Housing. The Sumerians actually did build structures for housing, and Dr. Robinson will fill you in and give you more detail about that as well. And what kind of families did they have? Was it patriarchal, which means kind of like the father, patriarch, father, or was it matriarchal? Was it more focused on the mother? Very interesting. We'll find out about that as well in just a few minutes. He will also lecture on another group of people that lived in ancient Mesopotamia, or present-day Iraq, if it's easier to configure it and figure it out that way, and dominated for a time. I mentioned at the end of the last lecture that this region was very chaotic and very unstable, as opposed to what you will eventually learn about with the Egyptian civilization. Egyptian civilization had its moments, but not as chaotic as Mesopotamia will be. Different peoples, different groups of people will fight. They will fight for fertile lands. They will fight for dominance, for power. We have a lot of different groups of people that you will eventually learn about that will coexist in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Near East. It's both ways. One such group of people, besides the Sumerians, are the Akkadians. And they will actually form the world's first empire under the leadership of a man named Sargon of Akkad. Sargon himself is a very interesting figure. Dr. Robinson will mention some of the stories, the legends about Sargon that have been passed down. One, of course, dealing with the fact that he was placed in a basket. I'll be very general because you'll learn more detail during the lecture. And floated down the river. Interesting to see some of the similarities with biblical history, as you'll find out, dealing with Sargon. Very intriguing legend. You'll hear more about this in a few minutes. The Akkadians will not just dominate the Sumerians, but they will eventually, when I use the word empire, they will expand. They will conquer more regions than just the southern half of ancient Mesopotamia. And the southern half, of course, is where the Sumerians are located and focused, as you see on your maps. that are shown during the lectures. So they will expand and not just take over the southern half. The Akkadians will also expand into the north as well, which is more of their base of operations anyway. We'll discover how the Akkadians created this empire. Sumerians around 3000 BC, just to give you a time frame. This is quite a long time ago. Akkadians shortly thereafter. What happened to them? It's not, when you think of this region today, you don't say, well, there the Akkadians live. So obviously, the Akkadians will not remain dominant in the region. And so we'll find out from Dr. Robinson exactly what happened to them. How did they lose power? Obviously, when they created the world's first empire. Another group that Dr. Robinson mentions in his lecture, they're called the Amorites, or the Old Babylonians. Where did they come from? Where are they located as far as the ancient Mesopotamian region is concerned? You probably, maybe, hopefully, if not, you will hear about their famous king in the upcoming lecture. His name was Hammurabi. Hammurabi, of course, is known for his famous, it's called the Code of Hammurabi. Interesting to discover some of the punishments that were utilized during this old Babylonian period. We're definitely not looking at equality before the law. It depends on if you were among the nobility or if you were a slave as to what your punishment was. Because the same, say a nobleman and a slave committed the same crime. They were punished differently. The nobleman, of course, maybe had to pay a fine. The slave maybe had to pay with his life. Okay, this very harsh. We're not talking just fines. I mean, there was also with the Code of Hammurabi, and you'll learn, more about this, but you had to go through trial by ordeals, and sometimes to prove your innocence, and usually those could end in death as well. So that will be interesting for you to discover. About Babylonian religion, we'll find out, is Babylonian religion the same as the Sumerians and the Akkadians, or is there any difference? Dr. Robinson will let you know about that. Discovered, of course, in this ancient Near East period, a lot of these peoples that come in and dominate and take over and lose power, and then another group comes in, we'll notice that a lot of the times they will absorb the culture of the people they dominate. They will also have their own, they add to, but they don't change the recipe. They maybe will add a new ingredient, I guess is a good way to put it. So the recipe continues down the line, just adding new ingredients as we go. Of course, we have to learn about how the Babylonian Empire fell. The city of Babylon, of course, will eventually be very famous. Not only do we have the old Babylonians, but eventually you'll learn about another group called the New Babylonians, or the Chaldeans. So there's two different groups of people, just for future reference on that. Dr. Robinson will also mention yet another, group of people. I told you there was quite a lot of chaos and instability in this region, named the Kassites and the Hittites. Hittites were located in what's today present-day Turkey. You may have seen it on a map as Anatolia or maybe even Asia Minor. But if you want to look on your school map, you can see Turkey, and that's basically where the Hittites will be based out of. Very powerful. The Hittites are very powerful at one point in history. They obviously do not remain in power as well, just like all the other groups that will come and go in the ancient Mesopotamia. All right, let's discover a little bit more about the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the Old Babylonians. Dr. Robinson?
Mesopotamian culture shows a great deal of continuity from Sumer down through the Akkadian Empire to the Babylonian Empire. Therefore, today we will talk about some aspects of Sumerian culture before getting into talking about the Akkadians and the Babylonians. In Sumerian art, one of the main types of figure that shows up is a religious figure from the religious mythology that we talked about in the previous lecture. We see a lot of religious figures that are characterized by very large eyes for some reason. There are also a lot of small figures of animals that show up. And in addition, there are what are known as cylinder seals, that is, rocks shaped in cylindrical fashion with writing on them that are actually used to seal important documents. Also, in the area of art, the Sumerians produced music. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about what it sounded like, but we do know that it was played on the harp or on the lyre. As for education, education took place in what was known as the Ejuba, or the House of the Tablet, to translate that into modern English. At first, education was something that was limited to a small, specialized class of people known as the scribes, that is, individuals who made their living from writing, from keeping records. But later, this extended to others, and the subject matter also expanded as well. Not surprisingly, it included reading and writing, which in Sumer were taught together as they are today. Now, that might seem automatic, but in some ancient societies, people learned to read without learning to write. Sometimes they learned to write without learning to read by simply copying what they saw. Closely allied to learning to read and write was learning to draw, which is something that was also taught in the House of the Tablet. Sumerian education included a good deal of attention to mathematics. It also involved a study of Mesopotamian literature and even some attention to biology, although the state of biology at this time was rather primitive by comparison with today. That brings us to the subject of Sumerian science. And perhaps the most important thing about Sumerian science in a practical sense in this period is that the Sumerians were pretty good metallurgists. They were good at making bronze implements, bronze tools, and bronze weapons. The third millennium BC is still all over the world, a period that we know, or all over the Near East at least, a period that we know as the Bronze Age, and in making things from bronze, the Sumerians were quite talented. They also made things out of gold and silver, typically more precious items, and they made items of a more practical nature out of lead. The main drawback to the metal industry, if you will, in Sumer was that all metals had to be imported. There was not a rich supply of metals naturally occurring in Sumer or anywhere in Mesopotamia, so they had to be brought in from elsewhere. One of the really interesting things about Mesopotamian culture is its system of mathematics. The Sumerians had what is known as a sexagesimal system of mathematics, so called because it's based not on the number 10, as our system is, but on the number 6. So you get a number of things in the system of the sexagesimal math that are multiples of 6. This is why, for example, in the minute we have 60 seconds, or in the hour we have 60 minutes. This is why in the circle we have 360 degrees, which is a multiple of 6. All of this comes from the sexagesimal system of ancient Sumer. And as modern mathematicians will tell you, in some applications, a sexagesimal system actually works better than one based on 10. The other thing that is noteworthy about Sumerian science is that they developed a calendar, a fairly natural thing to do if you live in a society that depends upon knowing when to expect the changing seasons so that you can plant at the right time, harvest at the right time, and so on. However, unlike their neighbors to the south in Egypt, the Sumerians had a calendar that was in some respects flawed. It was based on nature, but this is one of those cases where nature doesn't necessarily cooperate with itself. What I mean by that is that the Sumerians had a lunar calendar, a calendar based on the phases of the moon. Now that's a pretty obvious thing to do if you're marking time. The moon goes through its phases once every 28 days rather. In fact, our word for moon and our word month come from the same root for that very reason. The problem with this is if you have 12 28-day months, that's too short for a full solar year. If you have 13, that's too long. What the Egyptians later on did was to base their calendar on the motions of the sun and produce a much more accurate 365-day year. As it is, the Sumerians were constantly having to adjust their calendar to make it work and to stay in sync with the year. Nonetheless, it is the first calendar, and in that sense, it is a remarkable achievement because of the recognition of the need to divide up time and keep track of it. Sumerians also applied science to a lot of more practical areas, or to what we would call technology. They developed the world's first water clock, a fairly accurate one as a matter of fact. They built the world's first sailboats. They used plows that were made out of bronze, hardly as efficient as an iron or steel plow would be later on, but certainly better than what had existed prior to that time. In their architecture, they used both the dome and the arch, two architectural devices that are still used widely today and that are certainly used widely by the Sumerian successors elsewhere in the ancient Near East. They also learned how to manufacture paint and dyes and what have you. They produced cosmetics, which were just as popular among Sumerian women as they are today. They also produced all sorts of medicines, some of which actually worked, and they produced wheeled vehicles. So, if you want to give somebody credit for the wheeled vehicle, the proper people to credit for that are the Sumerians. Turning to Sumerian society, obviously, by the time we get to a point where the city-states have become kingdoms, the highest ranking individual in Sumerian society is the king. But below him, there was a small class of well-to-do and powerful individuals that might be described as Sumerian nobles or a Sumerian aristocracy. The majority of the population fit into an amorphous group of farmers and craftsmen and merchants and what have you, who are collectively referred to as the common people. And finally, at the lower end of society, there were some slaves. Not a lot. The majority of the population in Sumer was free, but there was a certain amount of slavery. And a word about slavery in the ancient world is perhaps a good idea at this point, since most Americans' experience with slavery, or knowledge thereof at least, comes from slavery in American history. In most of the ancient world, slavery could occur for several different reasons. It might be a result of being captured in war. It might be a result of getting so far into debt that you couldn't get out, a circumstance that many of us can probably relate to today. Or it might be a punishment for a crime, or even the case in some places that you might sell yourself into slavery for a period of years in order to get out of debt or some other problem. The big difference between slavery in the ancient world and more recently in the 19th century in America is that slavery was often a temporary condition, and slaves were at times very well educated and given responsibilities that went along with that education. As for how Sumerians lived, poor people often lived in houses made simply out of reeds, but increasingly as time went on, houses were built out of brick, made from the clay found all over Mesopotamia. Houses tended to be rectangular, built around a central courtyard, which was both private and outdoors, allowing people to relax there without being scrutinized too much. And most of the houses had a flat roof, so that it was possible to sit on the roof at times, or even to sleep up there in the summer when it was particularly warm. The Sumerian family in this period was patriarchal. That is to say, the man of the house dominated family affairs, the husband, the father, and so on. Typically, marriages were arranged. That is, young men and women didn't enter into marriage strictly out of love or strictly out of their own inclination, but their parents, in fact, arranged these marriages, a common enough occurrence in the ancient world. And inheritance among the Sumerians was patriarchal. That is, it passed through the male line, not through females. As far as how Sumerians lived, by and large, Sumerian men tended to have both very long beards that you see in many of the illustrations and long hair. The only adult men in Sumerian life who were clean-shaven were the priests. Men wore a kilt-like garment, and women wore gowns that were fashioned at the shoulder that actually would not be unfashionable even today. Now, around about the 24th century BCE, things began to change in Mesopotamia. And they changed because Sumer wound up being conquered by a state to the north known as Akkad, and whose people are known as the Akkadian people. The Akkadians, unlike the Sumerians, are a Semitic people, a designation that applies primarily to their language. They had migrated into Mesopotamia north of Sumer from the west and the north, possibly also from the east. And in the 24th century BCE, they found themselves in a very advantageous position relative to Sumer, because the Sumerians had been sapped by years of warfare among the various contending city-states that we talked about in the last lecture. This made them vulnerable, and it allowed the Akkadians to invade and conquer Sumer and to create the first empire in world history, to become the first imperialists in world history. In doing that, they were led by a king known as Sargon the Great. There's a good deal of mythology associated with Sargon the Great. For example, there is a story about him being abandoned by his mother in a basket and placed into a river that sounds very much like the story of Moses. There is also another story that at one time he had been a humble cupbearer in the city-state kingdom of Kish. But in whatever the case may be, Sargon began to achieve greatness when he defeated the Sumerian king Lugal-Zaghazi and began expanding his own territory. In fact, not only did he conquer Sumer, he also expanded beyond Mesopotamia, carrying on campaigns against Elam in the east, against Assyria in the north, and against Syria in the west. He built himself a new capital city known as Agad, and Agad became the center of a very far-flung international trade, reaching all the way to the Aegean and well past the Tigris and the Euphrates in the east. One of the things that this made possible was not only the enrichment of Akkad and the further expansion of Sargon's power, but it also led to cultural diffusion. Wherever Sargon and his people went, they took Sumerian culture with them. And this is a fairly common phenomenon in the history of empires. You often have a situation in which a militarily powerful people will conquer a culturally more advanced people, adopt that culture, and then spread it wherever they go. And that's exactly what happened here. Sargon and the Akkadians adopted Sumerian culture and took it with them as they conquered more and more territory. Under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire continued to achieve greatness, and in fact, things went so far that Naram-Sin himself was actually deified. That is, his people recognized him as a god, whom they called the god of Akkad. Now, we don't normally think of human beings as gods, but this often happened in the ancient world, with the pharaohs of Egypt, with some of the rulers in Mesopotamia, with Alexander the Great, and others. And as a matter of fact, Naram-Sin, once he had been deified, demanded that his people worship him. So in a sense, what he does is that he combines kingship with godship. He combines the power of the royal palace with the priestly temple, and is in fact both priest and king himself. He proceeded to conquer still more territory, most notably the ancient city of Ebla in Syria to the west, and he set up a very dramatic victory stela, that is a tall stone column with inscriptions on it declaring his greatness. Unfortunately for the Akkadians, another recurring feature of empires in history, this is the first one, but we'll see this again, is that conquerors often go too far. They often conquer more territory than they can hang on to. Generally speaking, conquest is easier than consolidation. And that proved to be the case with the Akkadian Empire. Another thing that often happens is that you'll have a series of good rulers, like Sargon and Naram-Sin, followed by less able rulers who simply aren't able to do the job that their predecessors had done. Again, this is what happened. So, following Naram-Sin's death, the Akkadian Empire began to disintegrate. It became subject to both internal dissension as the Akkadians fought among themselves and invasion from the outside, which culminated around 2160 BCE when a group of people known as the Gudians invaded and overthrew the last Akkadian king. In the slide that you see here is a picture of a couple of Gudian monuments declaring their achievements. This was something that most ancient cultures did, was to put up these monuments celebrating what they had accomplished. The Gudians would be dominant in the region for about 40 to 50 years. And then what happens there is a revival of the various independent city-states that had existed before the conquests of Sargon. Notably, this included the city-state of Uruk and the city-state of Lagash, and Lagash produced a particularly important king, King Gudea of Lagash, who you can see in the sculpture shown here. A man who had a reputation as a very wise ruler, whose statue makes it obvious that he was set up as a figure to be revered. He was even the subject of a hymn that was sung to him. Thereafter, about 2110 BC, the king of Uruk, Lagash's neighbor, King Utu-Hegal, drove out the Gudians, and then himself, 10 years later, wound up being overthrown by yet another king named Ur-Nammu of Ur. And as it turns out, Ur-Nammu's dynasty, which is often called the third dynasty of Ur, is the last of the great, primarily Sumerian dynasties. This dynasty built the great ziggurat of Ur. It also promulgated a law code known as the Code of Ur-Nammu, which is the first law code in the history of civilization. And interestingly enough, one characterized by a fairly humane set of punishments for crimes. By and large, criminals paid fines for what they had done. Unlike many of the law codes of the ancient world yet to come, there was not a lot of mutilation and there were not a lot of crimes for which one could be put to death. Now, Ur itself eventually faced decline. This is a recurrent theme. And around about 2000 BCE, the city-state of Ur began to see its agriculture tailing off and began to find itself subject to invasions from surrounding tribes. The most important of these, as it turns out, was a Semitic tribe known as the Amorites. The Amorites originally came into the territory of Ur from the Syrian desert to the west. And what they proceeded to do was to overrun a substantial amount of Mesopotamia and to establish a new dynasty in a hitherto unimportant city by the name of Babylon, which of course is very famous now as kind of a symbol for depravity and wild life. They proceeded over the next several decades to absorb all of Mesopotamia except the city-state of Ur itself, which became their principal rival. Ultimately, it was not the Babylonians or Amorites who overran Ur. It was their neighbors to the east, the Elamites, another group of people who, like the Amorites, frequently show up in the Old Testament of the Bible. For a while, after the Elamites overran Ur, the situation in Mesopotamia was this. The Elamites ruled the southern portion of Mesopotamia from a city called Larsa. The Babylonians, or Amorites, ruled everything else from the city known as Babylon. And it's out of this city of Babylon that we get the creation of the third great culture of Mesopotamia after the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and really the second great Mesopotamian empire, which was founded by the sixth king of Babylon, a man known as Hammurabi, one of the most famous figures in the ancient world. Hammurabi not only ruled over the Babylonian territory, he also proceeded to conquer the Elamites and Larsa and therefore make himself the ruler of all of Mesopotamia. Like Sargon before him, he then proceeded to expand outside of Mesopotamia and wound up conquering almost as much territory as his predecessor. As a general rule, one of the things that you find about the history of empires is that they tend to get bigger and bigger over time. This is a little bit of an exception. The Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi was never quite as big as that of Sargon, but it still dominated Mesopotamia and much of the territory around it. And quite significantly, one of the things that Hammurabi did in extending his influence was to conquer a city in Syria known as Mari, which was a major city of trade and which had been a rival for as long as it remained independent of his influence. Hammurabi himself is believed to be represented in the figure that you see right now of Hammurabi's head. He was a great military leader, obviously, to create an empire. He also, though, was a great diplomat who understood that it's easier to do diplomacy than it is to fight a war, and he was very good at pitting his rivals against one another so that they did the fighting a lot of the time and not him. A lot of his correspondence survives. Now, of course, this is not in the form of emails or tweets or even paper. It's in the form largely of clay tablets. But a lot of these survive. They allow us to know a great deal about his reign, and so he is one of those figures from the ancient world about whom we know quite a lot. One of the things that we know, based on those tablets, is that by the time of Hammurabi, the Sumerian language had begun to decline. Languages tend to be organic, that is, they evolve over time, and also when new people come into a region, they often bring their own language and supplant the local language that is there. Right now, the language that has done that the most in recent decades is English. In the case of Hammurabi's day, it was his own Semitic language, which was replacing the old Sumerian language of Mesopotamia. However, in many ways, his empire absorbed much of the rest of Sumerian culture, so that much of what we have had to say about that applies to the Babylonian Empire as well. There are no Babylonian kings after Hammurabi who measure up to him, and so fairly quickly after his death in 1750 BCE, the Babylonian Empire went into a period of decline. However, the city of Babylon itself remained extremely important. Regardless of who ruled the territory around it, it continued to be a cultural center, literally, for centuries thereafter. Now, if you look at the map that's on the screen now, you can see the extent of Hammurabi's empire. You can tell that it compares pretty considerably to that had been occupied by Sargon, although not exactly and not quite as extensive. Aside from his conquest, the thing that Hammurabi is best remembered for today is a code of law that is known as Hammurabi's Code. And in fact, Hammurabi's Code is one of those cultural phenomena that influences virtually everything that comes after it. Virtually every law code that we find in the Near East, including the law codes found in the Old Testament of the Bible, owe a certain amount of influence to Hammurabi's Code. Now, having said that, let me confuse you a bit. Hammurabi's Code is not a true law code. A true law code is one that tries to lay out general principles and then apply them to particular cases. That's not actually what Hammurabi's law code does. What it is instead is a collection of royal decisions. In Hammurabi's day, the king actually acted as a lawgiver and as a judge. And so the cases that he tried were written down, records were kept on clay tablets, and these came to be seen as precedents for how things should be done in the future. Sort of the way that the common law works much, much later in medieval England. His laws were copied down on clay tablets or in stone in some cases, and they came to be thought of as having divine sanction. That is, not only were they Hammurabi's laws, but it was believed that when Hammurabi made a decision, he was being guided by a power from above, specifically by the Babylonian sun god, who was known as Shamash, and who is basically the same god as the Sumerian Utu. So, if you followed Hammurabi's code, not only were you honoring the memory of Hammurabi, the great man, but you also were following the directions of the sun god. On the other hand, if you violated Hammurabi's code, not only were you violating a man-made law, you were violating a law that had the sanction of the sun god as well. Therefore, it was believed that those who followed the law received divine blessings, and those who violated the law could frequently find themselves cursed and enduring poor fortune. Now, what did Hammurabi's code actually prescribe? Well, for one thing, it was much harsher than the previous law code that we discussed. A lot of the crimes in Hammurabi's code were actually punished by mutilation, that is, by having a hand cut off or something like that, or by death. And the death penalty as carried out amongst the Babylonians in Hammurabi's day and thereafter was usually done in pretty painful fashion, shall we say. Perhaps the most humane way that you might be executed in Hammurabi's Babylon was by being hanged. Although bear in mind, hanging was not the science that it becomes later. You literally strangled to death rather than having your neck broken as it's done later on. Other ways included being drowned, being burned alive, or being impaled on stakes. So the death penalty was meant not only to be a deterrent, but a very, very horrifying and horrible deterrent as well. Now, when it came to the question of how you determined guilt, this is also interesting. The concept that we have today of a trial by jury, of being judged by one's peers, is not really part of Hammurabi's system of justice. Rather, there are two steps in the process of determining guilt or innocence that we will see repeated in other law codes and other practices of legality later on. One of these is taking oaths. In a case where somebody had been accused of a crime, he might be required to swear an oath in the name of the gods that he was innocent. But suppose there is doubt about that. Suppose there is evidence that points towards the guilt of the individual, even though he's swearing he's innocent, which naturally many criminals would be inclined to do. Then the court, or the king, resorted to something called the trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal is something that has taken many forms over the course of history, but the form that it took in Hammurabi's code was what we call ordeal by water. The guilty party was bound hand and foot and thrown into a body of water that was considered sacred or that had been blessed by a Babylonian priest. And if you floated in this particular instance, you were seen as being innocent. If you did not, you were seen as being guilty. Now, this sounds pretty primitive, all of this so far. But bear in mind, having a law code is better than having no law at all. Even a very harsh law code, even a law code that relies upon questionable means like trial by ordeal, is an attempt to impose law and order, to replace no law, or the law of the jungle, or complete chaos, with a more ordered system. Now, another peculiarity about the Code of Hammurabi is that it was unequal, and it was unequal in two different ways. It was unequal in how it saw the victim, and it was unequal in how it saw the perpetrator. Let's say, for example, that a nobleman who is a murderer killed another nobleman. That is a more serious crime than if that same nobleman had killed a commoner. And killing a commoner was a more serious crime than killing a slave. So a man who killed a nobleman got a more severe penalty than a man who killed a commoner, and he got a more severe penalty than a man who killed a slave, or committed any other kind of crime against noble, commoner, or slave. Okay? Now, the other way it applied equally, though, was that the higher your rank, the worse your penalty when you committed a crime. So, let's say that same nobleman kills a slave, and another slave kills a slave. The nobleman actually suffers a worse penalty. And the reason for that is the nobility at the top of society were expected to behave better. We're expected to set an example for the rest of society. We're expected to help maintain order. And therefore, the crime was, or the punishment was unequal in that respect. Now, we believe in a system where the punishment fits the crime and there is equal punishment for all, even if that doesn't work out perfectly all the time. Here, the whole theory is deliberately unequal. Now, another feature of this law is what the Romans later called lex talionis. But you probably know that by a more familiar phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, the punishment was meant to fit the crime. Quite literally, if you deliberately attacked someone and put out his eye, the penalty might be to have your own eye put out. Now, that might strike some people as perfectly just. It might strike other people as harsh. But think about this. This is another example of an attempt to impose order on the system here. Prior to the existence of the law, if you attacked somebody and put out his eye, he might retaliate by killing you and maybe killing your family as well, burning your house down. That is not lex talionis. That is not making the punishment fit the crime. Finally, Hammurabi's code is, like Mesopotamian society in general, highly patriarchal. That is, it tends to favor the male, it tends to give the father more power in the family, and like earlier Mesopotamian marriages in Sumer and Akkad, it is predisposed towards arranged marriages. Young men and women don't have a lot of freedom to make that decision. And of course, marriage is seen not primarily as a vehicle for romantic love, as it is in modern times, but primarily as a means of producing an heir and of passing on property. So it has a very important, almost business-like legal function. In terms of religion, under Hammurabi and the Babylonians, beliefs were very, very similar to what they had been under Sumer and Akkad. So a sort of pessimistic system, a polytheistic system, an anthropomorphic system with the very same gods. The major exception to that is that under Hammurabi, the emperor chose to elevate to greater prominence a hitherto minor god known as Marduk, who now rose to become sort of the chief god among the Babylonians, and who took the place of the old Mesopotamian god in the story of creation. Whereas Enlil, the Mesopotamian or Sumerian god, had played an important role in creation, under the Babylonians it was Marduk. Marduk, by the way, is a god who has some lasting power. He's still around in one form or another for a while, and is known by a variety of names. Sometimes he's simply called Lord, sometimes he's called Bel, sometimes, like later Semitic gods, he's called Baal, a word that, again, will be familiar to those of you who know the Old Testament well. He became the head of the whole pantheon of gods, and he was associated in Babylonian mythology with the defeat of chaos. Now, in Babylonian mythology, which is laid out in a piece of literature called the Enuma Elish, chaos takes the form of a dragon known as Tiamat. Now, chaos is, of course, the opposite of order. So if you have an orderly god like Marduk, who is trying to impose law and order on the universe, then chaos won't exactly do. So according to Babylonian mythology, the god Marduk defeats the dragon of chaos, Tiamat, and then creates mankind out of clay and the blood of the dragon. Now, this defeat of Tiamat is celebrated every year on the new year. Each year begins with a celebration of order triumphing over chaos. The way it's done may strike you as decidedly odd. It's certainly not the sort of thing that you would think about as going on in a church or synagogue or mosque today. One of the ways that the new year was observed and the victory of Marduk celebrated is that the king, whoever he might be at the time, had sex with a temple prostitute, which was considered to be a way for him to grow closer to the divine figure of Marduk. Not endorsing this, just telling you about it. As a matter of fact, temple prostitution was a regular part of the Babylonian religion, both as a way of carrying out certain cultic rites and, quite frankly, as a way of making money for the temple. Now, after the decline or the death of Hammurabi, as I said, the Babylonian Empire went into a period of decline. There were revolts from within against Hammurabi's successors, and eventually the kingdom split into three warring regions, three regions that made civil war against one another. The center remained under the control of the city of Babylon. The southern portion of Mesopotamia fell under the control of a group of people known as the Sealanders. And the north wound up being controlled by a group of individuals known as the Kassites. The Kassites were a classic example of being in the right place at the right time. What happened was this. The Babylonian Empire had a long and difficult relationship with a very powerful group of people to the northwest known as the Hittites. You will be hearing more about the Hittites later on, as a matter of fact. Around 1595, the Hittites invaded central Mesopotamia, plundered the city of Babylon, and left the Babylonians in a state of virtual collapse. The Hittites didn't stick around. Having plundered the city of Babylon, they took their loot back with them to their home territory in what's known as Anatolia. But what this meant was that the Babylonians were now vulnerable. And one of the things about Mesopotamia is that it's not that hard to invade. Its principal natural barriers are the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And if you can cross the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which requires only a boat, then you can get into Mesopotamia. So, as we have seen example after example of already, it's constantly being invaded by somebody. Well, right after 1595 BCE, when the Hittites overran the Babylonian Empire, that group of somebodies was a group of people known as the Kassites. The Kassites, as you can see from the map that I show here, invaded Babylon and proceeded to create a sort of empire of their own. Not as big as Hammurabi's, certainly not as big as Sargon's, but one which lasted from about 1595 BC down to about 1160. So an empire that stays there for quite some time. After the Hittites withdrew, the Kassites proceeded to overrun more and more of Mesopotamia. Now, unfortunately for us, their period in history represents a little bit of a dark ages, if you will, in the history of Mesopotamia, because very few of their records actually survive. Whether they were subsequently destroyed or whether they simply did not keep records as efficiently as their predecessors, we don't really know for sure. What we do know is that in the mid-12th century BCE, they ran into trouble with one of the perennial troublemakers on the east of Mesopotamia, the people known as the Elamites. The Elamites occupied a territory to the east of Mesopotamia, but they frequently crossed over into Mesopotamia to raid or even to occasionally conquer territory, as we saw earlier with the region around Larsa. In the mid-12th century, they did exactly that. They invaded and defeated the Kassites, but as fate would have it, the Elamites were not really able to maintain control over the Kassites, and as a result of that, they eventually withdrew, and the area of Mesopotamia once more reverted to its original state. That is, to a situation in which there were local city-states with local dynasties. During the first millennium BC, that is after the year 1000 BCE, the Kassites gradually withdrew from Mesopotamia and headed back northward into the Zagros Mountains. The Kassites remained there as a fairly unimportant people until the 4th century BCE, when, like so many of the people that we will talk about in this unit, they were conquered by Alexander the Great. They remained a part of Alexander's empire and of subsequent empires for some time thereafter, but in the 1st century BCE, they disappear altogether, becoming one of the mysterious peoples of the ancient world.
What an interesting topic. I find this part of Western civilization extremely compelling and very interesting. To think that we can actually know so much information about people who lived 3000 BCE. We've changed the way we say that now. Is simply amazing. If you noticed with regards to Sumerian art that the figurines, and a lot of times you see this, they have very large eyes. It's easy to recognize any Sumerian figurines because of that very feature. I found it interesting to know that and this is true for some of the past lectures with Mr. Elliott as well, and you can tie them together. With the invention and the starting of agriculture and the growing of grain and the being able to actually feed a lot of people being able to congregate and live close to each other in these cities, of course, another characteristic of civilization, that the leadership of these cities will need to have some type of system of keeping track of what they have, their storage and the food, which of course helps us to to gain this cuneiform and this writing here in this time period. I just find that interesting. And it wasn't just the writing that the Sumerians accomplished, but they also used mathematics, as you discovered in the previous lecture, the lecture that was right before this. And then literature, also mentioned, I believe, in the previous lecture, but there was actual literature. So we're not talking about people who were, quote, uncivilized, but people that studied biology, dealing with the Sumerians as well. They had a calendar, as you also, I hope, learned as well, but it was based on the cycles of the moon and not the sun, which of course made it a little bit off every now and then, so they had to make adjustments for that. But they had to know when to harvest those crops so that they can feed the mass of people that were, moving into these cities. Found it very interesting with the technology that Dr. Robinson mentioned about the perfumes and medicines and the wheeled vehicles, the plow. I find that it seems humans definitely continue to find new ways to make life easier, I guess, with technology at least. And it seems the Sumerians did the same thing that we seem to do in today's society. Sumerian families. Dr. Robinson talked about arranged marriages, which is not unheard of throughout history. In fact, there was quite a lot of arranged marriages, not just in the Sumerian time frame, but in much later history. And I love to hear about the cultural aspects of different groups of people. It's one of my favorite topics, and I like to see how people dressed and how they, like for example, the priest would shave. Others wore beards with long hair so that the priest, could be differentiated, and what kind of garments they wore. I find that very, very interesting. With the Akkadian Empire, I know we've mentioned the word Semitic, but there will be different groups of people that you will learn about throughout this lecture series, are related to different language groups, as we will find out. And it just so happens that the Akkadians were Semitic in nature, as you learned from Dr. Robinson. Let's see. Our next lecture, upcoming lecture, that we will discuss the Egyptian, another group of people not related to ancient Mesopotamia, but the ancient Egyptians, and we'll see about the differences between the two regions, how they grew differently and their culture. I can't wait to find out about ancient Egypt. Until next time.